There are some things you never forget. The sound of a grown man being laughed at in a room full of people who think they're better than him. That's one of them. I want to tell you about a woman named Celestine. No, wait. I want to tell you about what happened in a hospital boardroom in Hamilton, Ontario, on a Tuesday morning in March, and why the man they called the Janitor ended up saving 14 lives and a $22 million contract, while the chief of surgery stood there with his mouth open. Remember that. Hold on to it. Nolan Adeyemi had been pushing a mop through the hallways of Mercy Ridge Medical Center for 11 years. Not because he had to. That's the part nobody understood, and nobody thought to ask. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered in that quiet way, the kind of man who took up space without demanding it. His hair had gone silver at the temples sometime around his 48th birthday, and he hadn't minded. The gray suited him. He had a face that had seen weather, had seen grief, had sat with both long enough to stop flinching. His hands were large and steady. The hands of a man who had once spent 6 years in operating theaters in Lagos, then 3 more in a trauma unit in Nairobi, then 2 years doing humanitarian work in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake, before something broke inside him. Not his skill, not his mind, just something quieter and harder to name. The thing that keeps a man running. And he had come to Hamilton because his sister lived here, and Hamilton was as good a place as any to disappear into ordinary. He had let his Canadian medical licensing lapse on purpose, had chosen not to renew it, had chosen the mop, the cart, the early morning silence of empty corridors, the satisfaction of a floor that came clean. People at Mercy Ridge knew him as Nolan. Just Nolan. The man who always had a word for the overnight nurses when their shift ran long, who fixed the broken wheel on the linen cart before anyone asked, who once sat for 40 minutes outside the pediatric ward with a father who didn't know how to go back inside the room where his son was dying. Nobody knew what he'd been before. He hadn't told them, and 11 years in, it no longer felt like hiding. It felt like a choice he'd made and kept making every morning when he clocked in. That Tuesday in March, he was not supposed to be in the East Wing boardroom at all. He'd been called in at 6:45 because someone had spilled coffee on the carpet before the 7 o'clock meeting, and the facility's supervisor, a young man named Brett who was anxious about everything, had texted Nolan specifically because, as Brett always said, without meaning anything complicated by it, Nolan just handles things. So Nolan had come in with the carpet extractor and the enzymatic solution and set up quietly in the corner of the room. The meeting wasn't supposed to start until 7. He figured he'd be done and gone by 5:02. He was not gone by 5:02. Dr. Raymond Chiswick arrived at 6:58 with 4 members of his surgical team and a project consultant named Gerald Fitch, and they were already arguing before the door finished closing. Dr. Raymond Chiswick was chief of surgery at Mercy Ridge. He was 61, silver-haired in the expensive way, the way that got photographed for hospital newsletters, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had been the smartest person in every room he'd entered for so long that he'd stopped checking. He wore his credentials like a coat he never took off. He was not a cruel man, not intentionally. He was something more ordinary than cruel. He was a man who had simply never been required to look closely at the people beneath him. Nolan kept working. The carpet stain was stubborn. Someone had put cream in their coffee, and the extractor needed to run another pass. He moved methodically, keeping to the far wall. In 11 years, he had learned to become architecturally invisible in rooms like this. It was a skill, same as any other. Gerald Fitch spread a set of documents across the conference table. He was a consultant from a Toronto firm, 40-something, the kind of man who referred to problems as pain points and solutions as deliverables. He had been hired 8 weeks ago to help Mercy Ridge restructure their surgical resource allocation, specifically to redesign the scheduling model for the new cardiac and trauma wing set to open in September. The provincial government had tied a $22 million capital funding disbursement to proof of an optimized staffing model. If Mercy Ridge couldn't demonstrate the model worked on paper, with numbers, with projections, with utilization rates that held under stress testing, the money would be reallocated to a hospital in Mississauga that had submitted their framework 3 months earlier and was already breathing down the neck of Mercy Ridge's application. Deadline: 4 days. We've been over this simulation 4 times, Fitch was saying. He had a way of talking that was almost patient, but not quite. The utilization numbers collapse at the 12-hour mark every time. You're hitting a bottleneck in your anesthesiology coverage that the model can't distribute around. The whole framework fails. Dr. Chiswick sat down heavily. We have 9 anesthesiologists on staff, on paper, in rotation. Not simultaneously available during a surge scenario, which is exactly what the Provincial Review Board is going to model when they stress test this. Fitch pushed a page across the table. Look at hour 12. You've got a 4 OR simultaneous demand scenario, which is realistic for a trauma surge, and you've got 2 anesthesiologists available. Everything after that is a cascade failure. One of the surgical residents, a young woman named Dr. Preet, she went by Preet, nobody bothered with her full name, leaned over the document. Can we redistribute the on-call thresholds? We tried that in Simulation 3. It pushes the bottleneck to hour 9 instead of 12 and makes the collapse worse. Nolan ran the extractor over the last section of carpet. The stain was coming out. He kept his eyes down. There's also the interdependency problem, Fitch continued. Your trauma intake protocol and your cardiac protocol share 2 of the same anesthesiologists as primary coverage. That's a structural conflict. If both units activate simultaneously, which is the stress test scenario, you don't just hit a staffing gap, you hit a protocol gap. The coverage chain breaks, and you can't legally operate. Dr. Chiswick rubbed his face. So what are you telling me, Gerald? I'm telling you that without a fundamental redesign of the coverage architecture, this application fails, and I don't have a redesign. I've been trying to build one for 3 weeks, and I can't make the numbers work without either adding 3 anesthesiologists you don't have or restructuring the intake protocols in a way that would take 6 months of retraining to implement. Silence. Nolan had finished the carpet. He began quietly coiling the cord on the extractor. There's a rotational offset model. The words were out before he'd decided to say them. 11 years of staying invisible, and his mouth had simply opened. Every person in the room turned, Doctor. Chiswick looked at Nolan the way a man looks at furniture that has unexpectedly said something. A long, blank, recalibrating look. Then his expression settled into something that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt, but lived very comfortably between the two. I'm sorry, are you? He gestured vaguely at the carpet extractor. Nolan Adeyemi, Nolan said. Facilities. Right. Chiswick turned back to the table. As I was, the coverage overlap is a sequencing problem, Nolan said. He was not loud. He was not angry. He had a voice like a hand placed carefully on a surface, quiet and deliberate. You're assigning anesthesiology coverage in fixed blocks. If you offset the blocks by 90 minutes and tier the on-call activation thresholds differently for trauma versus cardiac, you break the shared dependency. The 2 protocols stop competing for the same bodies at the same time. Fitch had turned his chair slightly. He was looking at Nolan with an expression that hadn't quite decided what it was yet. Chiswick had not turned his chair. That's a very confident claim from the janitorial staff, he said. He said it to the table, not to Nolan. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One of the residents looked at her hands. I don't know what you think you overheard, but this is a fairly complex resource allocation problem, and I don't think... Staggered activation windows, Nolan said. You tier the on-call by specialty subcategory, not by seniority. Your 2 anesthesiologists who cover both trauma and cardiac, you don't put them in the same shift block, you offset them by 90 minutes. One activates at hour 0, one activates at hour 1.5. In a simultaneous surge, you still have a primary for each unit and you've broken the cascade. Chiswick turned now. Do you have any idea what you're talking about? Yes, Nolan said. It was such a simple word. No defense, no apology, no hedging. Just yes, with the full weight of a man who had earned the right to say it. Chiswick smiled, the thin kind. This isn't. Look, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but the people in this room have between them about 130 years of medical and operational expertise, and I really don't think that He paused. Let the pause do the work he didn't want to do with words. A facilities worker is in a position to solve a problem that a professional consultant has been working on for 3 weeks. One of the junior residents laughed. It was a small laugh, quickly swallowed, but Nolan heard it. He'd heard sounds like that before, in other rooms, other countries, other configurations of people who had decided what he was before he opened his mouth. He didn't flinch. He'd stopped flinching a long time ago. He looked at Gerald Fitch. "Do you have the scheduling grid?" Fitch looked at him for a moment. Then, very deliberately, he slid one of the sheets across the table toward the edge closest to Nolan. "Gerald, let him show me," Fitch said. He said it quietly, but Nolan set down the cord he was holding. He walked to the table. He did not ask for a chair. He stood, looked at the grid for about 45 seconds, just looked. The way you look at something when you already understand the shape of it, and you're only confirming. And then he picked up the marker from the whiteboard tray and drew a simple diagram on the back of one of the blank pages at the edge of the document stack. 2 columns, 4 rows, offset lines, 3 annotations in his small, precise handwriting. It took him less than 2 minutes. He slid it back toward Fitch. "The offset cascade," he said. "Run it against your simulation parameters. The bottleneck moves from hour 12 to hour 19. At hour 19, your utilization rate is 63%, which is under threshold. The protocols stop competing at the dependency point." Fitch picked up the paper. He looked at it for a long time. The room was very quiet. Dr. Chiswick said nothing. Fitch stood up and walked to the whiteboard and began writing out the parameters from Nolan's diagram, cross-referencing the grid. His pen moved quickly. Then it stopped. "This works," he said. He said it without looking up. Then he said it again, louder, like he needed to hear it twice to believe it. "This actually works." Chiswick took the paper from Fitch, read it, put it down, picked it up again, set it down carefully, the way you set down something you need to think about. Nobody laughed now. "How?" said the resident named Preet, and she wasn't asking about the model, she was asking about Nolan, and she deserved an answer, so he gave her one. "I was a trauma surgeon," Nolan said. 22 years. Lagos, Nairobi, Port-au-Prince. I worked in under-resourced units where we ran 3 operating theaters with 1.5 anesthesiologists worth of coverage and no margin for error. You learn very quickly how to sequence the bodies you have so nobody dies from a scheduling failure. He paused. Resource allocation under constraint isn't a consultant's problem. It's a survival problem. I've been solving it my whole career. Another silence. A different kind. "Your licensing," Fitch said, "lapsed by choice." Chiswick set the paper down for the last time. His face had done something complicated, cycled through several expressions, and landed on one that was difficult to read. It was not quite the face of a man who was sorry, but it was perhaps the face of a man who understood, for the first time in the conversation, that he was the least qualified person in the room. "I'd like to understand," Chiswick said, "why you're working facilities." "Because I chose to," Nolan said. "Same as I'm choosing to help you now." There was something in that, in the economy of it, in the absence of any desire to make Chiswick feel the full weight of what had just happened, that landed harder than anger would have. A few people at the table looked away. Fitch was already back at the whiteboard, working through the simulation. He turned after a moment. "I need about an hour to model this fully, but I want you in the room. I have a Ward 4 corridor to strip and wax at 9. "I'll clear it with Brett," said one of the residents, the young woman who had looked at her hands earlier. She said it like a small act of penance. Nolan looked at her, nodded. He sat down in one of the chairs at the table. Not at the head, he wasn't interested in that, but a chair, at the table, like a person who belonged there. Because he did. The simulation confirmed the model at 8:41 that morning. Fitch submitted the revised framework to the Provincial Review Board at 11. He included a notes addendum crediting the structural correction to a member of the Mercy Ridge team without specifying a name or title, because Nolan had asked him not to, and Fitch, to his credit, had respected that. The Provincial Board granted preliminary approval 3 days later, 1 day before the deadline. The $22 million stayed at Mercy Ridge. What happened after that happened quietly. the way important things sometimes do. Dr. Sandra Valakay, the hospital's chief medical officer, heard about the boardroom from 3 separate people before noon on Tuesday. She had Nolan's employment file pulled before lunch and spent an hour reading a career that looked, on paper, like a puzzle with too many pieces. She knocked on the door of the facility supply room at 2:30 in the afternoon. Nolan was restocking cart supplies. She asked if she could come in. She said, "I want to understand what it would take to get you back." He leaned against the shelving. "Back where? Practicing medicine. That's a long road. Recertification, supervision period, clinical hours." He said it without weight, just fact. "We'll fund it," she said. "All of it. The hospital will fund the recertification pathway and hold a position for you in trauma surgery. Paid study leave, full benefits, your current seniority transferred." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll need to think about it. Of course. I'm not unhappy here, Dr. Valakay. I want you to know that. This isn't. I didn't stay in facilities because I was trapped." "I know," she said. "That's actually why I'm asking. People who are running from something make unreliable doctors. People who made a choice and are at peace with it." She stopped. "I'd rather have you back because you want to come back, not because we guilted you into it." That was the right thing to say. He recognized it as such. "There's one other thing," he said. She waited. "Dr. Chiswick, yes, he's not a bad surgeon. He's just," Nolan chose the word carefully, "unexamined. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm asking that if I come back with the same standing as any other trauma surgeon on staff. No asterisk, no quiet footnote about where I came from." "Done," she said, without hesitation. He looked at her. She held the look without flinching. "I'll give you an answer by Friday," he said. He called his daughter that evening. Her name was Adeyemi, and she lived in Ottawa, and she was 31, and she had her mother's laugh and her father's stubbornness, and she was the reason, though he had never said this to her directly, that he had chosen Hamilton and quiet work and early mornings because after Port-au-Prince, he had needed to be close enough to ordinary life to remember what it felt like. "Dad," she said when he'd finished telling her, not what she thought, not what he should do, just Dad. In that voice she had, the one that meant "I see you, I have always seen you, and I am proud of you and furious on your behalf in equal measure." "I know," he said. "What are you going to do?" He looked out the window of his apartment. March in Hamilton, still gray, a last reluctant strip of snow along the fence line. In a few weeks the ground would loosen and the light would change. "I think I might go back," he said. "Not for them. For me. I think I'm ready." "You've always been ready," she said. "You just needed to decide." That was probably true. He'd been deciding for 11 years, in the long way that some decisions get made, not in a single moment but across 1,000 ordinary mornings, each one a small vote for the life you're building. "Will you come visit when I start?" he asked. "Dad, I'll be there the first day, obviously." He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere low in the chest and moves up. He hadn't laughed like that in a while. It surprised him the way good things sometimes do when you've forgotten to expect them. He gave Dr. Valakay his answer on Friday morning. He said yes. The recertification process took 14 months. Supervised practice, clinical review, examinations he studied for at his kitchen table in the early mornings before his facility's shift, because he didn't stop working in facilities until the day the certification came through. Partly out of practicality, partly because he had made a commitment, and he kept his commitments, and partly, if he was honest, because he wanted to finish what he'd started. On the morning of his first official shift as a trauma surgeon at Mercy Ridge Medical Center, he walked past the equipment room, where the mop cart still lived, and he paused for a moment, looked at it. Thought about the 11 years inside which he had found, unexpectedly, a version of himself he hadn't known he needed. A man at peace. A man who could sit with a grieving father in a hallway at 2 in the morning without needing to fix him. That wasn't nothing. That was in fact quite a lot. He kept walking. Adeyemi was waiting in the lobby. She had driven from Ottawa the night before and slept on his couch, and now she was standing there in her coat with 2 cups of coffee, and when she saw him come around the corner in his scrubs, new scrubs, the right kind, with his name embroidered on the chest, her face did the thing it always did when she was trying not to cry. He took the coffee. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Ready," he said. They walked in together. The doors opened. The corridor stretched ahead, clean and lit, and full of the ordinary, urgent noise of a hospital morning. The sound of people working, people helping, the sound of a place where it still mattered whether you showed up and whether you knew what you were doing. Nolan Adeyemi walked through it like a man who had been here before, because he had. Just not quite like this. There's something I want to say before we go. I think about rooms like that boardroom sometimes, the ones where someone has already decided who you are before you open your mouth, the ones where your uniform is your verdict, and your silence is taken as proof that you have nothing to say. What struck me most, when I first heard this story, wasn't the $22 million. It wasn't even the moment with the marker and the diagram. Though I've thought about that moment 100 times. The steadiness of it, the absence of performance, a man solving a problem because it was solvable and he could see it. What struck me was this: Nolan never needed them to believe in him to know what he was worth. He knew. He'd always known. He just hadn't decided yet whether he wanted to let them in on it. That's a kind of power they can't take from you. The kind that lives in the quiet years as much as the visible ones. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Talent doesn't keep office hours. It doesn't care what floor you came from, what door you entered through, what your badge says your name is. It is where it is, waiting patiently for the right Tuesday morning. I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in that room? Have you ever been the one standing at the edge of a table that wasn't set for you, holding something no one thought to ask you for? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. And if this story stayed with you, if some part of it reminded you of someone you know or someone you've been, share it. Pass it along. There are people who need to hear that the quiet ones sometimes hold the whole answer, and the world just hasn't gotten around to asking yet. I'll see you in the next one.